there is a very robust and rapidly growing resistance around the world. And so not to despair and to recognize at the same time we are in this for the long haul. And honestly, what we need as a society, and I suppose I come from a place of compassion and love, and I don't like violence. And I know that Paul will probably disagree with me about this, but I feel that the most effective means of at the local level of trying to work with people is to try to understand what makes them take the positions they're taking. So understand the crowd dynamic, understand when somebody has been brainwashed, and try to help them.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to Freedom Feature. And with me today, I have a number of special guests. This is the first time we've ever been literally across the world. We have a special guest from Australia. We have Gigi Foster. Gigi, welcome to our program today.
Thanks very much, Barry. It's a pleasure to talk with you.
And we have also Michael Baker. Michael, where are you from?
Well, I'm actually from Australia. And I have I'm an American-Australian dual citizen.
Okay.
And I'm living in Thailand.
Thailand.
Figure that one out. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. And Paul Frijters, you're in Saudi Arabia, I understand.
I am, and I have an Anglo-Dutch heritage, but lived in Australia for 15 years. So that's the common denominator.
Okay, great. Well, it is so awesome to have you all here with us. And with modern technology, we're able to have this conversation, and what a conversation it will be. And thank you, folks, for who are watching. You will not want to miss what these people have to share. They have written a book, The COVID Panic. And if you haven't received a copy, I encourage you to look it up. You can buy it on Amazon. But they have also written an interesting article, one that really caught my attention. There we go, The COVID Panic. I have an e-version. I don't have the actual paper copy. So thank you so much for showing that. And we will want to make sure that we have that information at the bottom of your screen so that you can just do a quick click and be able to buy that book. We are coming together today because we want to talk about the situation that we find ourselves literally across the world. For those of you who are in Canada, you know the situation we have here with what's happening with the vaccine mandates still in force. We have a situation in this country where unvaccinated are unable to fly, go by train, or take a ferry anywhere in this country because they are unvaccinated. And of course, we already know what the Prime Minister thinks of the unvaccinated as misogynist, anti-science, racist. And he asked the question, how do we deal with these people? And that's quite something for a leader of a country to say. But these people who are with us here today, who are scholars, who are economists, who have looked at this situation and have come out with a very different opinion than our own Prime Minister on the state of affairs. And so I want to welcome each of you here. And I'm wondering if each of you could share with our listeners who you are and your background. And then we want to get into some interesting discussions about this entire COVID panic.
I suppose I'm sort of the most common denominator, being physically in Australia. So I am a professor of economics at the University of New South Wales, and I have been here since 2009, came to Australia even before then, and really was in a very fortunate position at the start of 2020 that I had already been studying very much in collaboration with Paul Frijters, in fact, some of the elements and aspects of economics and human societies and sort of behavioral economics that are very relevant to understand if you want to know what's happening during COVID, to make sense of it. And so I basically just feel very privileged and lucky to have already been studying things like power and loyalty and group networks and group dynamics. So I was kind of primed to be able to make sense of what was happening during the COVID period. And I certainly wouldn't have chosen, what's happened, but it has been an amazing experience as a social scientist to be able to witness it, because it's given us, observations that I just had not had in my lifetime, particularly on things like crowds and the psychology of crowds and the impact of some of the changes that we've seen even leading up to COVID in the dynamics of power and concentration of industries and globalization. So it's been just an amazing period, but of course also an absolutely tragic and horrific period to live through. And I'm very grateful that the Brownstone Institute decided to take up our book, and we'll get into the story of that, I'm sure, later in the podcast.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, Michael.
Look, I'll be a little bit briefer than that, because I'm the odd one out of the three here. I'm not the academic. I'm more of the journalist in this whole project. So, as you're probably aware, academics are not always the best at communicating their ideas to the general public, and I think it was really important in this instance that this was not an academic work. So, I do have an economics background, but it's in commercial property consulting, actually. So I'm kind of coming from the dark side of the economics profession as a practitioner, and having clients who are actually some of the people who maybe came in for some criticism in the book itself. But really my role was to ask questions, make sure that the ideas were communicated in a way that were readable, accessible for a general audience.
Okay, Paul.
Hello, Barry. I'm Professor Paul Frijters. I've sort of been an academic and an economist in various roles, including a health economist. But I think most relevantly, the 5-6 years before, I was a professor of economics at the LSE, the London School of Economics in London, and developing and then institutionalizing in the UK a cost-benefit methodology for well-being, which is exactly for this kind of problem that we face, namely what are, roughly speaking, the various costs and the various benefits of doing a whole society-wide intervention like lockdowns, like stay-at-home orders, like forced vaccination, and is that worth it? Is that worth a bang for the buck? And that requires a sort of an overview of many different parts of life, the health side, of course, but also the economic side, also the social side, the happiness effects of preventing people from getting married, preventing people from using IVF services. And so you sort of need a whole of society view, which is particularly what economists are good at. So that is also what we sort of bring to the table over and above medics, who are often busy with a particular disease or a particular patient, but don't necessarily see the damage of what they propose to the rest of society, including the health damage. So there's sort of a single focus illusion within many medics, and economists in that sense are exactly the kind of advisors to society for what the overall picture is. It's been one crazy ride, that's for sure.
Oh, incredible. I just want to say that it was your book that, and I don't even know how I got onto it, but soon after it was published, I came across it and I was like, it's kind of like you're looking around society and you're saying, is everyone on Prozac or is it just me? It's just like the whole place is gone bananas and I'm trying to make sense of it. And then I came across your book and I'm like, oh, maybe I'm not so crazy after all. And that then got me into the Brownstone Institute, which allowed me to also keep track of the various great articles that Jeffrey Tucker was involved with. It was just so awesome to be able to find a place where people were actually, looking at this from the big picture and not so narrow focus. And the way the governments have responded in this has been something that you'd read out of a sci-fi kind of situation. Well, it was 1984, right? I mean, it's Orwellian beyond. So tell me, how did you come together to say, okay, this is it. We've got to put this book together. And by the way, let me compliment you. And for those of you who haven't read the book, it is very accessible, as was mentioned. But one of the things I thought was really neat is that you have 3 main characters there. And maybe you can explain how that came about. But that to me just really makes it accessible for sure. But how did it come about?
So maybe I'll take that one on. So back in March and April of 2020, Paul and I particularly were sort of sanity checking ourselves against each other and against any other friends who would listen, including Michael, and trying to work out exactly as you were saying, who's going crazy here, us or the rest of the world. And Paul very quickly started, in fact, it was in mid-March, I think, that he started blogging. Jeffrey Tucker had started blogging about the issues as well, I think even the previous month. And I was speaking out in various events here and in my radio program. I have a national radio program here in Australia. And so we were saying these things, but we were getting this massive amount of pushback and flack for saying them. And I suppose over the next, the ensuing several months, I kept waiting naively for the Australian government to come out with a cost-benefit analysis that justified their draconian policies. And it just wasn't coming out and wasn't coming out and wasn't coming out. And I, first of all, miscalculated on how long the fear would last, how long we would be in this state of madness, because I had not understood crowd dynamics as I really should have, I suppose, but we'd never encountered them as such in our lifetimes. And so I guess I forgive myself a bit for that. But, I should have been a better student of history, perhaps, to be able to predict that. But I didn't. And so finally in August, with Paul's help on the guidance of it, using his well-being methodology that he had just developed at the end of 2019, I constructed this 4-page sort of proof of concept cost-benefit analysis of lockdown policies here in Australia and presented it to the Victorian Parliament, one of our states here, Victoria. I was hoping it would go somewhere, but it really kind of didn't. But, the testimony is still on the website. But, it was so difficult to get any traction. And I think it was around that time, maybe September, October of 2020, that Paul and I just said to each other, look, we've got to write this up. He had so much blog material. I'd been talking about it and writing about it and putting it on the airwaves here. And we just felt the alternative viewpoint needed to be written down for the historical record and really to help people like yourself and others who just felt very confused by what was happening and wanted to, felt like they were a stranger in a strange land, basically. And they needed some sort of way to understand it and to think that something else was possible. So we expressly wanted to have a bit of focus on what we can do next to recover. So that's why the subtitle. So it's the Great COVID Panic, what happened, why, and what to do next. So it isn't just a takedown of or a deconstruction of what actually happened, but also some degree of guidance and forward-looking activities that we could put our efforts to try to recover from this mess. And the reason to bring on Michael was that Paul and I had previously written a treatise together called An Economic Theory of Greed, Love, Groups, and Networks, which is about as grandiose as the title sounds in terms of its ambitions. And it was reasonably inaccessible, I would say, to the modern, sort of guy on the street. And we thought it was great, but it was just not particularly accessible. So we knew that, in order to really crack into this, the market that we wanted, which was not just academic economists or academics full stop. It was really anyone who had a critical mind and, was interested in understanding what was happening. We needed to have a better exposition a more accessible exposition than we had brought to our previous work together. And Michael seemed the perfect person. He was a great writer, lots of experience in the trenches, actually dealing with people, business people. He knew what they would want to hear, what would resonate with them. And he also had at his fingertips a lot of interesting stories about business people and knew how to find that information. And we're in our ivory towers. We don't really have that. So then the final thing, I guess, is just about your question of, how did we decide on the 3 characters? And I can remember having a Skype call with Paul in probably it was about October or November out on my porch. And he was like, thinking we need to have like characters or something like a device like that. Do you think it would work? And we were bandying about this thing. And he had written a previous book that was basically a documentation of corruption in Australia, where he had used a couple characters. One was named, I think, Bruce was it, or James, Bruce, and somebody else, and it seems to work for that book. And that book as well was targeted to the everyday Australian who wanted to understand corruption in his society. And so they had 2 characters, one of whom was kind of the exploiter, and the other was the exploited, right? And so based on that experience, I think he thought, well, maybe it could work. And so we bandied about how many characters should it be, what are the actual archetypes going to be like, and then it sort of seemed to slot in, particularly given the book is a lot of threesomes, right? We've got Paul and myself and Michael. We've got 3 stages of the Great COVID Panic, which we may get into. We've got the 3 characters. We've got 3 types of countries. 3 of our children even feature in the book in different ways. So it's a lot of threes, triumvirates going on in the book. It's
very well done, and I want to congratulate all of you for a job well done on this, because it really helps us. For those of us who are trying to understand what on earth we've been experiencing, it really helps. Okay, so let's get into this idea of, okay, so what's happened, why, and what's next? I like that. Let's stick with the threes, and we'll have some other questions as we move along. So who would like to go next, Paul or Michael?
I think that's Paul's.
Okay, Paul.
Yes. Well, what happened, I think the crucial insights we came to sort of within 2020 was that we were probably looking at a panic, right? We dubbed with the idea that this was all planned in 2018, 2019. And of course, afterwards, no matter what kind of craziness happens, there's always somebody who says they planned it, and then there are 100 others who say, look, that evil genius has planned it. But we didn't really see much evidence for a plan. We just saw a lot of opportunism. We saw a lot of abuse of a situation by lots of people who were either hiding stuff or they were propagating stuff. So we thought a panic went around the world via social media, particularly kind of this huge emotional wave. And we could see this in our own circumstances. I was lecturing then at that time in London with LSE. And from one week to the next, my students turned, as it were, into a pumpkin, right? So they were critical. They knew that the risk weren't very big. They knew about the age gradient. And they knew that this thing would go pandemic and go endemic at some point in time, just like many other respiratory illnesses, and there'd be life after that. We shouldn't take it too seriously. And a week later, they were sort of mad, right? They were sort of like, oh no, we must lock down society. And when you try to have a rational conversation with them, well, why? What do you expect that to be good? What would the costs be of that? They were sort of bewildered, right? They'd already turned mad, as it were. So that's a panic reaction that the world had, and we don't really see a clear culprit for that. You might say social media itself is a culprit for that. You might say that there were particular groups of academics and maybe the WHO which were sort of fanning on the panic, but it was also a very human thing, and it went through all kinds of societies. So it went through the West, but before it went through the West, it went subsequently conquered North America, South America, India, Africa. And so there's not really a cultural explanation for it. It's just humanity, right? We are prone to sort of become panicked if we notice that everybody around us has sort of become very fearful of something. So it was kind of like a stampede. That's really what happened. And then there was the abuse of the stampede, right? So politicians sniffed more power, medics sniffed the opportunity to boss everybody around. The vaccine companies decided, oh, we can make billions on this. People started pushing masks. People started pushing up. Let's keep everybody at home so we can supply them with our internet stores and hence lobby against actual stores. And there was all kinds of opportunism that then happened. Right? And then there was the question of, okay, given this opportunism and given, as it were, the coalition of interest that gelled around a continuation of this madness because they were effectively making money out of it, or at least greater political power, what can we do in the future? And so there are several ideas we discussed. One is that you should almost see the social media as a weather system, and a weather system that can give rise to storms of panic. And so you'd like to have something that sort of shortcuts those panics. And how to do that is not so easy, but it's clear that you'd have to do that in the media space. You'd have to do that very early on with governments who would then hopefully be more minded towards reducing panics rather than riding them. And of course, you'd like to have a bit of justice for all the negative things that have been done, right? The best way to avoid bad behavior in the future is to punish bad behavior in the past, because the past, of course, the last 2 years have been bad behavior by politicians. They have broken public health rules of the preceding 50 years. They have instituted society-wide experiments without having a good idea that the cure was better than than what sort of was lost. And that in principle violates Nuremberg codes. And so there should be justice for that, right? That was against the pandemic plans that were there. That was against WHO advice of 2019. So in a way, that was not just done, but was also immoral and we suspect illegal. And then there's a third thing, which is that, our societies have shown that it's easy for vested interests to abuse us with propaganda and with nonsense pushed around in our media. And so the question is, can we rebuild our institutions to some degree to make them more robust, to have more points of view everywhere in the system, rather than this, what we call monoculture, that everybody has the same opinion, that you don't hear anything else. And one of our ideas for that is to use citizen juries. So to have citizen juries who would, for instance, in Canada, appoint the top of the Broadcasting Corporation, the top of the statistical organization, the top of the ministries, one jury, one top position. And the idea is that breaks the link between Trudeau and those appointments, between the miners and other vested interests, which I know are very strong in Canada, and those positions. So you sort of get back a civil society-focused layer of public servants. Now, we can talk a lot more, but that's in a nutshell are the main elements of our book.
Over the years, I've been very interested in bubbles in the stock market, or, I think of the tulip mania. I think of, the East, East Asia Company, or what, in English history, there was a big panic at the time that even John Newton or Isaac Newton got involved in. And it's like, and to be honest with you, I got involved in the craze of investing in stocks with technology and all the rest of it, and we all came through a horrendous experience in 2000, and then in 2008, and all the rest on the market. So it's always been fascinating with for me, as I've looked at history, if I experienced it myself, getting caught up in the crowd. I remember one time going to a political rally with someone who was a leader of a party that I didn't even agree with. And everyone got up, started clapping, and I got up clapping too. And I remember thinking, what on earth am I doing? I don't even agree with this guy. And I actually got up and I clapped with everyone else. And I remember one time my mother, we went to a hockey game out in Alberta, and she always was, she had 3 boys and a daughter, but the 3 boys in particular, we were hockey nuts, and we still are. And we went to the stadium. My mother never went to a hockey game in her life. She never watched a hockey game in her life. But when Wayne Gretzky scored and the entire place erupted, let me tell you, she was up and she was just going, she says, I don't know what I'm doing. And it's kind of like that kind of sense. It's like this massive panic went through, and families are being split up as people who are the dissenters are cast aside. But here's another thing then. It seems that, and I'd be interested to have your views on this, but it seems to me that when I look at government and how they have basically purged from the bureaucratic levels all those who were dissenting and are unvaccinated. And I wonder if we could ever get back to the place where we would have the opportunity for people to be able to even have within the institutions those who would be willing to stand up to something they see that is wrong. In other words, there'd be a voice of opposition, whereas now it seems like they have purged the bureaucracy, they've purged the major corporations of anybody who would say anything that would be against the narrative. And is that not a problem that we have got to address somehow?
I mean, I think this is one of the reasons why none of us is expecting we're going to emerge from this crisis quickly, because indeed what you're finding around the world, including here in Australia, but I know also in the US and Canada, is that those dissident thinkers who have been kicked out of their various positions are starting to form new networks and new institutions, new organizations, new structures to provide the goods and services that basically the existing institutions have proven unable to do because they're so heavily corrupted. We've called on previous podcasts that Paul and I have been interviewed on for the disbanding of certain scientific journals, which have just betrayed their mission, their scientific mission during this period. And really, once an institution gets too sullied and too tainted with their with its, hideous decisions during a period like this, it's kind of beyond saving. And so I do expect that we'll continue to see more of that, more new institutions, more new ways of doing things. And so in some sense, that's a place of joy that we can go to, is to recognize, look, there'll be a rebirth, a bit of a new renaissance. Of people finding each other from, places that they would never have otherwise been, across the world. I now have a resistance network with people I would never have met had it not been for COVID. And the people you find indeed are those who, as you were describing when you were, talking about your experiences at the hockey game and whatnot, they can reflect on their own behavior. They may themselves be group animals at some level. We all are. But there's an element of being able to take yourself out of the group situation and examine it, and sort of almost have this aristocratic or arm's length view of the crowd. And that's something that is common across many of the people in the resistance that I've met here in Australia and around the world. It certainly is common across the three of us, the Great COVID Panic author team. And it's something that you kind of, you learn early on, I think, or you just have the personality of being, I had a pretty lonely childhood, for example, or I was not part of the popular girls, any of the cliques. And I learned I was the only child. So I learned quickly that, I was not going to experience whatever positive things were being experienced by those girls when they were together, but I could observe them. I could, look at them as if looking at a petri dish, and try to figure out what was going on. And my mother was a psychologist, and that kind of helped to tweak my interest in understanding the psychology of people, particularly in groups. And that's something that I've studied my whole life. And so that kind of attitude is not, it doesn't exist in everyone, but I've found a lot of the resistors around the world have it. And it is something that, is another lesson from this period for everyone to carry forward, is to recognize when brainwashing is happening, when the crowd has essentially taken over people's independent thinking process. So when you're in a crowd and you're not reflecting on it, the fact that you're there, you can't see it yourself. What's happening is you've outsourced your own personal usual determination of what is true, what is right, what is good to the crowd itself. Right, just like in 1984, right? If the leader of the political party says that we are now at war with Oceania, then gosh darn it, we're at war with Oceania, right? I'm not going to think about that, right? I'm just going to take the line from that leader. And so that's exactly what we've seen during this period. Even people saying at cocktail parties, and you ask them, well, what do you think about masks, right? And I had someone say, well, what do we think about that? Which by itself tells you, what do we think about that? She's not using her mind, right? She's appealing to some notion of an abstract group. So that's a lesson for us going forward. And I do expect more new institutions, and that it will take a very long time to redeem and reconcile with some of the existing institutions we have that have so badly betrayed their ideals.
So with that, Michael, one of the institutions that we have all been very concerned about, and that is media. And as a journalist, what are you seeing?
It's one-way traffic as far as the media is concerned. I would give you a developing country, an Asian perspective, specifically Asian perspective on this, which is that there's been so much self-defeating behavior in order to be part of this crowd. And as you know, a lot of the governments around here, particularly in Asia and Indochina, so we're talking about Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, are all authoritarian governments where the media is basically an instrument of government power. And the governments that are not outright dictatorships, kind of nominal authoritarian states, and talking about Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, and these places which are nominal democracies, but that's about all. It really has been one-way traffic. And as far as the media is concerned, and I think particularly distressing, has been the lack of opposition from the business community, particularly professional trade associations and business leaders who are representing small businesses, which are really the lifeblood of these economies. You come to expect it, I suppose, in an authoritarian state. There's this silence. There's really no effective opposition. And I think looking from here, from this vantage point, and looking at the developed world, what has been really astounding has been the lack of effective opposition, the lack of opposing voices in the media and elsewhere against this crowd panic. And still, And as far as institution building is concerned, that Gigi was just referring to, I don't see any of that happening in this part of the world anytime soon, and certainly not as a result of this.
This raises a great point. One of the experiences we had over the last several months was the truckers in Canada. It was spontaneous. It was not organized. I mean, it was organized in a sense of, okay, guys, let's get ready. Let's okay, we'll meet here. We'll go. But there was no big major organization here. They go to Ottawa. It is a very peaceful protest. I was there for 3 days in 2 different weekends. And the government came down hard. I mean, it came with a sledgehammer. It invoked the Emergencies Act, which basically meant the Trudeau was a dictator for 9 days, froze bank accounts. In other words, what's happened is that the institutions of power have doubled down, and they're doubling down again. They're still refusing to allow the unvaccinated to fly in this country. I mean, I'm just wondering, and I don't want to be a pessimist on this, but and there is, I should say as well, a growing sense. When the Prime Minister was down in New Brunswick, as I mentioned, there was a great sense of emotion of people cussing him to such an extent, and yet, of course, the mainstream media did not report it, but it got out on social media. But one wonders just how long or what we are yet to experience, because look at what's been happening now in China and Shanghai, right? So it's could it actually get worse? Could it actually be that our government authorities just double down?
Maybe I can answer that, right? I think first off, the truckers' protest was well followed by the co-resistance in other countries. So I'm quite active in the Dutch resistance and a little bit in the UK resistance, and there we were all cheering on the truckers and thought they were doing a great job. And particularly to keep it peaceful, and how people came out of their homes to feed them and to give them money and to sort of supply them with fuels to sort of circumvent the draconian restrictions put on them. And I think the experience was exactly the same in Australia. And so, this kind of, draconian authoritarian reaction was awful. And particularly awful was also that I knew quite a few of my Canadian academic friends were cheering on the authoritarian response, right? I think more than half the Canadians I know loved it and would have liked to see the trucker shot, if at all. Right? Yeah. So yes, we are in scary times, but I do have hope for the long run future. And one of my main reasons for hope is that this kind of authoritarianism is extremely inefficient. I mean, it just makes you poorer and poorer and poorer. And Western populations are ultimately quite ambitious and sort of want things for themselves. So people will vote with their feet. They will just move to other countries. Companies will move to other countries. And people just want to have a bit of fun in their life as well. So they'll go off on their holidays to Florida, elsewhere, and they won't come to Canada. And that kind of thing, jealousy and inefficiency breaks it. You can only keep doing stupid things for so long until you run out of money, until you run out of, as it were, social capital with the rest of society, and people will then look for alternatives. And they might not build an alternative in their own society, because that's a lot of work, but they'll run to another society in which things are operating better. And then in the rundown societies, they copy stuff. So, in the developing world, they copy a lot of the institutions in the West, and they're bound to do this time as well. Once a couple of Western countries work out how to undo all this nonsense and build better and more robust institutions, the rest of the world will just copy them again. So I'm not really negative in the long run, but it can be a long slog. That's definitely the case. But to give you hope, there clearly are countries and regions which are operating fairly normally. I mean, Scandinavia is a very normal place. Sweden didn't see a day of school disruptions, not really. No mass to be seen. In Florida and Texas, the ferry has been broken, as it were. And you see, as it were, an awakening in many countries. So it is more a question of time. So when you ask how long, well, historically speaking, this kind of madness can last for years. I mean, just think of the Nazi period, think of the First World War, think of the prohibition in the US. This sort of thing could be a few more years, but I don't think really it will last a few more years, even in Canada, because it's so clearly impoverishing. And you can only keep a lid on things with power for so long. Wouldn't expect that. Maybe 1-2 years max in Canada would be my prediction.
Your recent article, which is one that really struck a chord with me as well, because just as in the stock market, and I use that as because I see it in my own life, when things go bad, you're really down. You're thinking, okay, everything's going bad, and all of a sudden things start shooting up, and things become really good. And so, one of the things that I look at is that those people who have suffered tremendously are naturally going to want vengeance. It seems to me that vengeance is one of those human emotions that come into play. And your recent article kind of touched on that and said, okay, what is it that people will not forgive? And I'm wondering if you want to open that up for us right now. And
division of labor. Oh my God. Well, there are a couple of things people find hard to forgive. One is a loss of status. We are naturally prone to want to regain a high level of social status. So those who lose it, those people who've lost CEO jobs, have gone down in the pecking order, were sort of fired from the administration where they previously had a high job, and they're now fired as troublemakers. That kind of anger burns long and hard. That can go on for a decade. Those people will still be running court cases in 10, 20 years' time against this. But we also think another thing people will find hard to forgive is permanent health damage, particularly in a situation where they're going to have to pay for health and where there's uncertainty. So it's a little bit like Gulf War syndrome went on and on and on amongst the veterans. We think the vaccine health damage is going to creep up and up and up and up and up in the scales of what people keep getting back to. They'll be worried about what their kids have been injected with, what they have done to themselves, how their immune system has been affected, the growth of cancers, the enlarged hearts, the blood clots. And they'll be wondering, would I have this problem with that? So those two things, loss of status amongst those who were sort of fired for no reason, or whose business was destroyed for no reason, which is rather a lot, and the vaccinated who suspect that they've been betrayed.
So we might mention that the reason why that's Paul's question is that Paul is really the well-being researcher. He's studied well-being about as much as you can study it. And human well-being, of course, as many of your listeners may not be aware, is the maxim end of our discipline of economics. We actually want the most human surplus, well-being, happiness, however you like to say it, for everyone that we can get out of the scarce resources that we have. And so all of economics is sort of ultimately geared towards designing institutions and setting up policy schemes and regimes such that that we do in fact produce as much as we can that actually makes people happy and otherwise have societies that promote people's happiness. So in that literature, which is, oh gosh, I mean, Paul will know how long it's been around, probably a couple generations now, there's a lot of study of what it is actually that makes people happy and how they respond in terms of their happiness levels to various kinds of life shocks. And one of the life shocks you might imagine is most relevant during the COVID period is a death of a loved one from COVID, for example. But as it happens, the well-being literature shows you that kind of shock, as tragic and horrible as it is, and I mean, I've experienced that myself. My mother died about 6 years ago. It does really throw you, obviously, and you have to grieve and whatnot, but you do recover your sense of well-being or happiness or life satisfaction is the way that it's typically measured in the most recent research that's leading the charge in terms of how we should measure human well-being as governments. And so after a couple of years, you've sort of forgotten that. So the question really that we asked in our recent blog for Brownstone was what kind of pain is going to last long enough to kind of continue to fuel the call for maybe, if not vengeance, then perhaps just a reckoning, some kind of reconciliation, some kind of a truth commission, in different countries. Whether here in Australia, we have the tradition of running royal commissions whenever the society seems to think that something is going badly enough. I have my doubts about whether that would actually result in much change here, but just because we've had prior royal commissions on other things like the banking industry and really nothing's budged, but it still is the traditional kind of mechanism. South Africa had a very useful, I think, truth commission after, the apartheid phase. And if you set it up correctly, those kinds of things can be, not as much a vengeance-filled, hostile, violent kind of affair as an opportunity to simply have voices aired which have been censored or omitted entirely from debates previously, but have been truly harmed. And those people need to be heard, in order to move together forward as a society across the aisle, including in family groups that have been split down the middle by COVID policy, right? To be able to reunite with each other locally and at the more regional and national levels, we need to have those conversations, and we'd like to have them in ways that don't involve violence. Because I agree with you that there will be some desire for blood. But so the question in our article was what's going to fuel the call and the effort that would be needed to set up those kinds of commissions, truth commissions, reconciliation, or indeed the more violent options, which of course we hope not to see, but may be in store in some places.
I think that a lot of people are going to be extremely disappointed reading that blog piece. At least my sense from, I probably track social media a bit more than the other two. And my sense is that over the last several months, a lot of people are very, very much hoping that there'll be a reckoning based on things like loss of freedoms, censorship, and all that. There's a lot of anger about that, which basically the blog piece comes over and kind of puts that in the cold shower. But in fact, those are not the things that are going to be able to sustain rage over the long term. So I think there'll be a lot of people disappointed reading that.
Because they want vengeance, and you're saying, hey, what can we do to...
And they feel very, very strongly about these issues, about the loss of freedoms and all of the other things that happened over the last 2 years in the course of lockdowns.
I mean, it's also sort of shocking, right? Because what we say in the blog is that social status loss matters, and that is not a particularly appealing thing to say about your species. Social status, that sounds like, oh, you're a materialist. All you care about is your status, what a pig. But the reality from the well-being literature is that's the thing that really sticks with people, and that can be extended to losing the best years of your life if you're a young person, or losing your health.
My granddaughter, when COVID first hit and they weren't even allowed to be out on the playgrounds and all the rest of it, and so my daughter and her family live in Vancouver, and it was like serious lockdown. And so anyhow, they went up north to my son-in-law's parents' house in northern BC, and as they drove into the little town, my granddaughter saw another park, and it had no yellow tape, and she said, oh, look, there's a park, and then my daughter had to say to her, oh, I'm sorry, honey, but you're not going to be able to go on that one either. And then she says, well, this is the worst year of my entire life. And, it's like, it is. And I know of individuals, local businesses, not too far from our house here, a man who put everything into his business. He put up the plexiglass, he put up everything, and still they had another lockdown. And unfortunately, he decided to end his life. And it's those kinds of stories and the extreme amount of pain that people have been going through, that it seems to me for us to be able to get past this, we got to have, first of all, a recognition that something, what we did was wrong. So there has to be official recognition of, what, we goofed up here. And number two, we need to listen to the people who have suffered. And I think that having them being able to, like you mentioned the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, having the ability to be able to share their pain brings about a lot of healing. And it seems right now, at least in this country, we're nowhere near of having any official say, you know what, we goofed up, this was wrong. So it's going to take some time yet, it seems, for the evidence to come out and for more and more brave experts who many people I have talked to over the last while, individuals who have studied all of the medical epidemiology into the biology, into all the even those who are been studying vaccines and so forth, have lost their jobs, just been kicked out of the universities. But like you say, there is this networking going on. And that was one of the things that I saw when I was up in Ottawa during the trucker protests, was the fact that there were a lot of people. Mind you, it was bitterly cold. I mean, one of the things that I think frightened the federal government was that we had massive protest in Ottawa in late January, early February. We're talking minus 25 degrees Celsius, wind chill minus 30. It was bitter cold. And yet the first weekend, they estimate somewhere around 100,000 people just crammed in around Parliament Hill. I mean, it's just like, this is unheard of. I don't think we've ever had anything like this at that time of year. I mean, coming up in May, that's when you begin protesting in Ottawa, but not in January. And so that kind of shows you the angst that has been going on in the population. And it seems to me that we have to get to the place where the officialdom have to recognize that, you know what, we've goofed up. And that's probably going to take some time, like you say. And so how do we get the official narrative changed?
Well, here in Australia, we have an election coming up in May, about a month from now, and I've seen even before the election that in some of the states there's been a changing of the guard, kind of quietly. So the person who was in charge here in New South Wales for most of the period of COVID, Gladys Berejiklian, was ousted due to a supposed corruption charge or something, and a new guy took over, and it was much easier for him to simply chart a slightly new path, right? Politically, it was much easier for him. And so one of the hopes for Australia's elections coming up is that there is a message sent to the large parties, all of which have basically been complicit in the crimes of the COVID period. So over here, our big parties are Labour and Liberal, and they also have the slightly less big parties, the Nationals and the Greens, who support the ones that are on their side of politics when they get in power. But we have an enormous number now of these freedom-friendly minor parties, we call them, which, range in their views on other things, from, gay rights to abortion to gun rights to whatever else. But on COVID issues and generally on freedom to move around and to go to work and to go to study, they're pretty much united that we did the wrong thing and whatnot. So I think one obvious way is to simply change the guard. So I don't see Justin Trudeau anytime in his lifetime, unless he is forced by the institutions of power, the legal system, whatnot, admitting that he's messed up, right? It will have to be somebody else. And so the question is just how you get there. And I don't know enough about the Canadian political system to know what's most feasible, but certainly here in Australia, it's trying with those minor parties. We have a preferential voting system, which means that there actually is more of a possibility of getting some of those people from those parties or the independents into positions from which they can then argue a little bit their case and therefore shift the debate slightly.
Maybe I can also add to that, Barry, that as it were, expecting official apologies is, I think, unlikely to happen in most countries. And it's for a good reason, which is that there's enormous liability hanging on whether or not there'll be apologies. Right? Just think of the damage that they've done, ruining a whole cohort of children for 2 years. Well, just think of what's that worth in terms of lifetime incomes, and that for a whole population. Ka-ching. Think of the damage done to health and disrupted health. Everybody who's lost a loved one, but also who had to pay for their own health, or who has to pay now for new operations. Just think of the medical malpractice suits that could follow from an official apology. Ka-ching. So there's just enormous commercial interest riding on not admitting any mistake. Mm-hmm. And so in that kind of situation, what tends to happen is, as Gigi says, there's a kind of a fading out of the old narrative and a new thing coming with, a new obsession. It could be Ukraine, or it could be, climate change, or it could be something else to distract the population. But not, as it were, openly saying, oh, we, this identifiable group who you could take to court, is now admitting that it's done wrong in this enormous way. That will take near a revolution. And don't kid yourself, that near revolution will be bloody in other ways as well, because if you would have the power to force politicians into an apology, you have an awful lot of power, and you won't just start with an apology. Right? We are then talking about a very scary situation in which that's even conceivable. Right. I mean, the last time that happened was in Germany, when the Nazis were just rounded up by the Americans. And unless somebody rounds them up, it just doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess the stakes are extremely high, aren't they, as a result of this experience? And hopefully we can learn from it. That's the positive news I hear from you is with respect to this. I'm concerned that we may go through a very tumultuous time yet, because like you say, right now, Ukraine is the big story. However, lurking up behind is the idea we're all going to die because we drive our cars. Is the next one that I'm sensing. The Prime Minister here in this country have just raised our gas taxes again. We're now at $1.88 in Toronto for per liter for gasoline, but he's now going to be doing it right up until 2030. Every year there's going to be an additional tax. It's like, this has got to happen right away. You know, everyone needs to be driving electric cars, all the rest of it. And so it's kind of like, okay, now we're into a new phase now, a new panic of things. And if we don't have that cost benefit analysis from experts like yourselves, we're going to be into another crazy moment, it seems to me. I want to thank you all so very much for your time. Is there any final word that you would like to share with our listeners as we look forward to the future, as we brave this new world? Or we go into this brave new world?
The thing I would share is just that they are not alone. There have been so many people who have come to me out of the woodwork over this period saying, oh, thank goodness I finally read something sane, or, I finally found someone who's saying something. And it's not just us, right? There is a very robust and rapidly growing resistance around the world. And so not to despair and to recognize at the same time, we are in this for the long haul. And honestly, what we need as a society, and I suppose I come from a place of compassion and love, and I don't like violence. And I know that Paul will probably disagree with me about this, but I feel that the most effective means of at the local level of trying to work with people is to try to understand what makes them take the positions they're taking. So understand the crowd dynamic, understand when somebody has been brainwashed, and try to help them when possible to confront some of their beliefs. And it's going to be very difficult. You'll get abuse, you'll get name called and all sorts of stuff. But to keep simply and rationally and sanely and compassionately stating your case, we need people speaking out like that, because that's what the good person does in the face of something that's not good, right? It's what evil triumphs if the good don't speak out. So you must, I feel it is a duty almost to our social health and our children's future to continue to state as much as you can your version of reality and have that be part of the chorus of voices that are being heard, so that at least there's something to counteract the gargantuan monovision and mono message of the media and government and the crowd.
I also have a couple of messages. One is that a lot of resistance can just be local, right? Setting up your own school together with other mums and dads or caring partners. Also setting up, local, as it were, health delivery platforms, right? To sort of bypass the official structures that are no longer working. Set up local reading groups, right? Set up local dating groups, right? I think that there can be a huge blossoming of civil society married with there's lots of social production. And that leads to the second thing, that is this coviscent stuff can be fun. And one of the surprising things for me has been that it's actually an incredibly tolerant place, right? We have now found ourselves on the same side of people we wouldn't have wanted to be with 3 years ago. I've found that they're not as crazy as they seemed, right? People who say, look, over 50 years ago, and instead of immediately running away, I sort of go, oh, really? And, I let it slide, right? That sort of thing, right? And that is the joy as well, right? The having a tolerance within, because we're such a huge common enemy. Who cares that you don't agree with somebody on everything, right?
Right. I just like to point out on when I was in Ottawa and again, crowd dynamics again, and I was thinking about that. Like I'm in another crowd, but I'm in a crowd that think the same way as I do on this issue. And I remember thinking, man, this feels good, just to have everyone around me who are not thinking that I'm crazy. And there was just this absolute exuberance of joy finding people of like mind, people from Quebec, who could hardly speak English. And yet we were communicating and having a great time together with my little wee bit of French that I know. But, it was a wonderful experience. And so there's that dynamic as well. Sorry, Michael.
Gigi and Paul have given us a very uplifting way to end, I think. We're still really very much picking up the pieces here in this part of the world. We don't really know some of these things, some of these measures have kind of taken on a life of their own, and I don't know anymore whether they are government mandates or whether they are things that businesses and individuals have just taken on and they're just doing it out of habit. So I suppose all of that will kind of dissolve very slowly over the next few months, and people are just looking forward, overjoyed to be, as you just said, getting back together again, and being with other like-minded people and doing the things that they did before. And of course, the downside of that is that what has happened, they'll be very, very slow to grasp that, to remember that they will not remember that so easily, which is the downside. But I think the return to normality, or relative normality, is a really wonderful thing that's going on at the moment.
And let's hope it continues. Well, folks, I want to thank you so very much for being with us today. And this is the first for me, literally having a world conversation. And for those of you who have been watching, hope you've enjoyed our time together here on Freedom Feature. We make it a policy that we want open, fair, and honest conversations. And that means there may be some conversations we have that you may not agree with. You may not agree with our guests. You may not agree with me, but that's okay, because that's why we're here. We're wanting to open our minds to what's happening around us, and especially what we've been experiencing over the last 2 years. So thank you. And until next time, I'm Barry Bussey. The fight for freedom consists not only in the legal battles in court, but also in the battle of ideas at the universities and in the media. It takes time, effort, and money to keep on top of the debates for freedom. Your donation allows us to keep fighting for all Canadians. Firstfreedoms.ca